Hello, everyone. This is JVL sitting in for Charlie Sykes, who is on vacation. Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I am joined today by Bill Kristol, my good friend, editor at large of the Bulwark. And Bill, not a lot of holiday cheer today. Going to be kind of a dark episode. Is that okay?
Do I have a choice? Of course it's okay. People expect no less. I mean, it's kind of your brand, and I've been fairly gloomy, I've got to say, the last few weeks looking at the situation around us. So yeah.
Okay, let's start by talking about COVID. I wrote yesterday a long excavation of the House Select Subcommittee on the COVID response. I am deeply disappointed with how unserious the subcommittee is in general. Like, its report reads like third grade partisan politics. You know, everything Donald Trump did was terrible. Everything Joe Biden has done is wonderful, which is not what the purpose of something like this should be. What we need is a very serious after action report like we had following 9/11, identifying the system's failures and figuring out how to fix them. Right. I mean, this is the largest government failure in certainly all of our lifetimes. We're over 800,000 dead Americans in under 24 months. Uh, we we need to understand what's going on, and this House subcommittee is not going to get the job done. That said, when you strip away the partisan BS that's inside this, and you look at some of the emails that they have turned over, and some of the interview transcripts they did with people on the inside of the administration, it is nothing short of gobsmacking. And we thought we knew, to a large extent, the general contours of how bad things were inside the Trump administration in the early days. But were you as surprised as I was, or no?
Well, first, I very much agree with your general point. It would be nice to have a 9/11 Commission type report. I don't know if we will. Maybe we'll have to put that together the way you did in the newsletter yesterday. Will Salanton had a good piece in Slate, and we just pick out the key facts, the key contemporaneous documents, and make those famous. And I mean, the narrative isn't that complicated. It's the good news. We're not dealing with foreign terrorists assembling in 10 different places, and how did they get in? And we're not even really dealing with kind of the level of complexity of why did the FBI and the CIA not talk to each other, right? We're dealing with, I think, a couple of pretty straightforward things, and you make these points well in the newsletter. I mean, one, Trump, and the total irresponsibility and beyond irresponsibility, just not caring that tens of thousands, ultimately hundreds of thousands of people would die because he wanted to make it look better, and he wanted to say what he wanted to say, and he did say what he wanted to say. We all said at the time how irresponsible he was being, and we were right. I think it's an important point, actually. Let me make the second point for now, and then we should come back to Trump, because I think people are still sliding too quickly over how unbelievably bad that was, and sort of unusual in American politics. Presidents make plenty of mistakes, but this kind of willful willingness to consign tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans to an unnecessary death is kind of something else. But the second thing is the system also. Well, I guess two more things then. Second is the degree to which people in his inner circle, the decent people, the public health professionals, I guess calculated that they were still better off going along. They could stop some bad things from happening. They undoubtedly did stop some bad things from happening, and maybe helped accelerate a few good things. But the degree to which they kept quiet instead of speaking out is really astonishing. I remember when Olivia Troy defected from the Trump administration and came over to Defending Democracy Together and Republican Voters Against Trump, and we talked a lot. I talked a lot with her during that time. You talked with her too. I mean, the degree to which, even she, and she's been wonderful, it took her a while to get out of the mindset of, well, we have to just stay in there and make it as good as we can. And again, I don't think that's an unreasonable thing for public servants to think, but they could have done a lot of good for the country by blowing, some percentage of them could have left and blown whistles, or stayed and blown whistles, incidentally, and make Trump fire them, as opposed to confining their disagreements to emails, or in the case of Deborra Berks, not going to a particular session, just absenting herself from D.C. on that day. And then the final point, and then I'll be quiet, and we should go through all of them, because you've studied this stuff carefully, is the system itself. I mean, leave aside the individuals, the public servants, the appointees. There were pretty big deficiencies in the system itself, and those we've seen carried on, I think, into the Biden administration.
Yeah. Well, for instance, the FDA process on approving the rapid tests, right? We go into the whole. This is one of the things where absolutely a failure of the Biden administration. The FDA has a kind of ridiculous amount of box checking that has to be done to approve tests. That's the reason we don't have adequate numbers of tests right now. This should have been solved back in February of this year. But anyway, can we talk a little bit about the Deborah Berkses of the world? I have taken a very hard line against Deborah Berks, and she seems to me to be an especial case of somebody who was willfully going along, not only just going along and keeping her head down because she thought she could do good, but alibying Trump where needed, stroking him, saying publicly things about the president's intelligence and intellect, which were simply false, which she didn't believe, nobody believes, which aren't true. And all of which is done under the guise of, well, if I wasn't there, then it would have been some MAGA head Yahoo. Then it would have been Scott Atlas, running it. And maybe that's true. There's something to that. But on the other hand, at some point, there is also, as you say, the opportunity cost of not going out and starting a public crusade from outside the administration about what's happening. And this happened during the Trump years over and over again at every level. Jim Mattis leaves and, he writes a very nice, strongly worded resignation letter, and then he disappears from public life. John Kelly, right, first chief of staff, he leaves and then goes off and whispers to Jeff Goldberg at the Atlantic, presumably on background, but never says another word publicly. The number of people who over and over again just decide, people who had real power, who if they had decided, I am going to turn myself into a martyr here, and really just bang on about this, might have been able to move things, might have been able to make a difference, might have certainly hardened public opinion in a useful way. So much of what happens in these things is the complicity of people not being willing to take stands. And I don't understand it. Maybe it's always like this. Is it always like this? Is this human nature?
So I would distinguish a couple of things. I mean, I think it's a very good question, and I think you're right in general to be really outraged about it. Now, if you're in there and you're doing good, let's say you're the person at the third level who's running the vaccine process, and you're arranging to buy hundreds of millions of them, and you're working very closely with the CEO of Pfizer and everyone else, and you loathe Trump and you think he's doing a lot of damage, but that's your job, and you think it's good for the country to get these vaccines as soon as possible. I have no problem with that. And little problem is you then go on some spectrum over towards Deborah Berks or towards even worse rationalizers and sort of sycophants. There are different gradations of why you could or should have stayed in. But I think you point to a very important part, which is once you're out, why keep quiet? For me, that was the Mattis and Kelly dereliction of duty. And again, it's one thing, okay, why should they just pop off, you could say, in the middle of 2018 or 2019? What good is it going to do? Trump's president until November 2020. Maybe they still have some access into the administration. They can still do some good. We get back into that somewhat grayish area. But there was an election on November 3rd, 2020.
Yeah.
For me, that's the decisive sort of moment at which anyone who's no longer in there, and probably some people who are still in there, need to say, I have seen this person up close. I'm not going to reveal if I think it's inappropriate private conversations or, certainly not classified information and so forth, and not going to reveal anything that's going to damage the country for the next few months as long as he's president. But he should not be president for a second term. And what is so astonishing is how few of them, really a handful only, Olivia Troy and Elizabeth Newman and a few others, were willing to say.
And Alex Vindman, right?
Alex
that's
Vindman,
about it.
Yeah, I saw him up close, and he should not have a second term. And, Vindman, somewhat different. I love Alex, but yeah, he testified for Congress and then was asked to and did his duty. So that's also another case where it's a slightly different case.
He did his duty, and John Bolton didn't. John Bolton saved everything for his book.
But Bolton did, to his credit. I would say Bolton went further than these others because Bolton,
fair enough. At least he put it in a book.
Well, and also he said he wouldn't vote for Trump, remember, in September of 20.
Summer of 2020. That's right.
And he didn't quite say he could vote for Biden. And so there's a lot of hemming and hawing. Good. But I do give him credit for saying, I've seen this man up close and I can't vote for him he shouldn't be president for a second term. The failure to be willing to say that, and again, Deborah Berks could have said it on October 30th. I mean, she could have done as much good as she could do for the country and then, dramatically resigned a week before the election. That would have been important. But no, they didn't. And maybe there's some norms of public health, as there are of the military and others, where you kind of keep your head down and do your job. Again, the military guys could tell themselves, we could probably prevent a lot of damage after November 3rd and before January 20th, and some of them did. And again, I don't, so I hope some of them got fired, like Esper. But, so again, there are these slightly complicated calculations. But no, I'm totally with you in general. And especially on COVID, what's the actual? I mean, there, with all due respect to Deborah Berks, there are a lot of intelligent public health officials, and Trump already was listening to the Scott Atlases of the world, right? I mean, it's not like Larry Kudlow and more importantly Peter Navarro and those people weren't already in the White House and pushing things. How many bad things did Deborah Berks stop? I mean, maybe she did stop some. If so, she should say so. But I haven't heard that much about that.
Yeah, I believe her case for herself rests on I was so effective when I ran around the country and talked to the governors. That's where I really made a difference. I guess maybe, but again, there's always an opportunity cost. There is a cost to not having spoken out and to aiding and abetting the whole thing.
Yeah,
and
very much so. But it really muddies the waters of normal presidential errors, mistakes, incompetence, even a bit of venality, perhaps, adjusting things for political reasons when you shouldn't do so. It muddies all of those things which are American politics or politics as usual and Trump's behavior. And the line gets blurred in a way that it needn't be and shouldn't be, because this was a kind of malfeasance, misfeasance, I don't know what the right word is, dereliction of duty that we don't, thank God, see every day. And we saw it with him, of course, on COVID. We saw it with him on democracy. So real twofer there, I mean,
yeah, and yet he is got the support of 44% of the country, even still today. That's the gobsmacking part, is that he's not 10% worse than anybody else in American history, right? It's all totally new, uncharted territory. And 5 years ago, if I had described to you what all that would look like, you would assume that he would have the support of 15% of the country.
Yeah, and I think this gets to your point about the system breakdown and the establishment's complicity in what happened and the failure to stand up to Trump in this respect. Think about Nixon. And I'm older than you considerably, and I remember I was in grad school then, I guess. Nixon quit. There were a lot of Republicans who thought he'd been kind of done dirty. He did some things that he shouldn't have done. But Kennedy and Johnson did too. And look how they bugged Martin Luther King. And look at all these other politicians. Some of it wasn't crazy, incidentally. And, Nixon did a little of this stuff, but ultimately it didn't have any real effect, you might say. He tried to monkey with the 72 election a little bit. And mostly backed off ultimately. And the Congress found out what it found out. Anyway, these are people who they were against his removal from office. That he had 50% support among Republicans the day he resigned. And I imagine if you had polled them 2 years later, 3 years later, some number of them would still have had a favorable opinion of Nixon. His favorable wouldn't have been at 10% among Republicans. It would have been 30 or 40 or maybe 50 even. But the establishment was strong enough then that it was not respectable to go around being a pro-Nixon Republican in 1976 or 78. You didn't have to go around denouncing him. You could privately have coffee with him and get his advice on foreign policy. There was a gradual rehabilitation coming. What he did was a lot less bad than what Trump did, obviously. But even so, the establishment was strong enough, the norms were strong enough, the safeguards were strong enough that everyone understood you couldn't allow that. And so people, even like Reagan, who had defended Nixon until pretty close to the end, they didn't make an issue of it one way or the other, but they certainly didn't embrace Richard Nixon. That's, of course, the huge contrast with Trump, who's so much worse and so much more embraced to the point that he's now, of course, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination in 2024.
You have a piece up today saying that it turns out that the 2020 election was not D-Day, it was Dunkirk. And that's a very profound analogy. You want to just sketch it out for 5 seconds for people who haven't read it yet?
I've been using that analogy a bit, like in just remarks and informally, and I'm now worried, of course, that I got it from someone else, which is entirely possible. Who can remember whether you said it to me or Pete Wainer said it to me or Moto Charon said it to me or it came out of some discussion with someone I don't even know, after an event somewhere. But I think maybe I thought of it since I'm kind of a Churchill fan, so maybe this would have occurred to me before others. No, the simple thought is we kind of hoped the defeat of Trump would be D-Day. It would not be the end of the fight. It wouldn't solve all problems, but it was sort of a key inflection point where after that you could see your way to the end, and you would get to the end. And in the case of D-Day, a year plus, and a year, I guess, and whatever the timetable would be for Trump and Trumpism. Instead, it turned out to be Dunkirk. Well, it isn't that for the reasons we just said. He's the leading. The Republican Party's gotten worse, not better. He's the best chance to be the Republican nominee in 2024. The anti-democracy forces and I don't know what the right word is. I use sanity in the piece, I think, but sanity, rationality, the pro-conspiracy forces are as strong or really stronger than ever. So it is more like Dunkirk. We escaped the worst case, and we shouldn't ever forget that, which is Trump being reelected. I mean, that really is a very big deal. We were on the live stream a week or two ago, weren't we? And you made this point, I think, that, 2020 was a bad year in some ways, but the one thing you got to say is that Trump did lose, and then January 20th, he did leave office. And that's not nothing. And we were right that we could not afford for him to be reelected. And all the conservative establishment types who were, I've got a more sophisticated view. I'm not never Trump. I'm maybe Trump, or I'm sort of Trump.
Trump skeptical.
Yeah.
I'm just Trump skeptical.
But at the end of the day, I think maybe that very important to acknowledge how important it was to defeat Trump, and also to, I think, wrap that around those people's necks, frankly, and a total lack of judgment and understanding of what was at stake. Having said that, it is like Dunkirk in the sense that we escaped a very bad situation, lived to fight another day. The system lived to fight another day, if you want to put it that way. Democracy lived to fight another day. But as was the case 6 months after Dunkirk or whatever, Britain was not winning exactly. We weren't in the war yet. And, the huge uphill struggle remained. And in some respects, I would say a year after, at the end of this year, almost a year, more than a year after the election, slightly less than a year later than January 6th, we're sort of worse off in terms of democracy than we were, with the exception of Trump being out of office, a big exception. And we're sort of worse off in terms of conspiracy theorizing, rationality, truthfulness, and et cetera, in the body politic. Don't you think? I mean,
I totally agree. Let me give you two examples. The first is that if we were in, let's pretend it's May 2020, right? We've got 97,000 Americans dead. And I say to you, hey, guess what? It's going to turn out that we're going to have a vaccine that'll stop this thing. But we're going to have 30% of the country, most of whom are concentrated in a single political party, and they're going to refuse to take the vaccine. Do you think that sounds realistic? I think most people would have said no. Most people would have said no. Anti-vax will be a standard 8 to 10%, because you always have a standard 8 to 10% of the cranks, and they will be evenly distributed because it's just crankiness. It's just weirdness, and everything will be fine. It turns out that not only has the percentage of people who are anti-vax been much, much larger, but that because they've been concentrated in a single political party, they have become a constituent group that even the pro-vax people in that party feel like they have to pander to. That's crazy and not something we would have expected. Point number two, in May of 2020, many people, including the two of us, believed that the Republican Party and Donald Trump would wind up being abjectly anti-democratic and willing to attempt to overturn an election. People told us we were crazy, but we thought that we knew that. By the beginning of 2021, we all know it. And yet people seem to care less about this sort of authoritarian streak, right, which is now comprising a very large part of one of our political parties, even though it's no longer a theoretical matter. It's not an academic question. We now have the proof. We've seen the evidence. We've seen it happen. And yet the rest of the country is just kind of, that's a problem. Again, all of these problems are society problems. They're not even really elite problems. We get here because Susan Collins says, I'm not going to vote to convict Donald Trump on impeachment because I think he's learned his lesson, right? I mean, it's those little steps that you take along the way. And it's the voters and the people who look around and say, well, I guess, we've lost several 100,000 people to COVID, and sure, that January 6th thing was bad, but I don't know, gas prices are high, so maybe we'll vote for him again. Like, this is...
Yeah, no, another way of putting it, I think that's good, is if you had said to us, there's going to be January 6th, it's going to make Trump's going to lose and then try to overturn everything, both with his own Justice Department and Defense Department and with Republicans at the state level, and then January 6th. So on the democracy front, it's going to be unquestionable that he's anti-democratic, that the people who worked for him were engaged in such an anti-democratic conspiracy, an attempt at usurpation, really, that the authoritarianism becomes, front and center. Would we have said, yeah, but still in December of 2021, the party is going to be as Trumpy as ever, basically, certainly more, I'd say, broadly anti-democratic down to the state and local level, Republican Senate candidates competing with each other to be demagogic, authoritarian, violence, inciting, and so forth. And on the COVID front, we're going to have a vaccine in January, because it was December, right, that we got it really, and it's going to work. But on the public health front, people are going to be almost a third of the country is going to be crazy. And the system's not going to be fixed much either, even though we're going to have a better administration. And so we're not going to do a really very good job, unfortunately, in saving lives and keeping people healthy. Those are two pretty, you would have thought the defeat of Trump and January 6th on the one hand and the vaccine on the other would have laid the groundwork for a pretty good 2021. And in some respects, of course, it did. In some respects, things have improved. But in these two fundamental respects, it's pretty astonishing that the public is more conspiracy-minded and as authoritarian-minded as it was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, it's really, we've talked about this so many times, but there is a question of whether or not decadence is at the heart of it, right? So people talk themselves into believing, I think, over the last 10 years or so, well, the public seems like we're a bunch of decadent, unserious people, but if there was ever a real crisis, then people would snap to and people would become serious again. And, we could still be the country that responded to 9/11, the country that existed during the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. And we've now had that. We've had it with the most serious crisis in 100 years in America. And in fact, we've gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I suppose, this sort of depends on one's overall theory of history. So my only slight way I would put it, or slight qualification of what you said, or addition, maybe is better. The public turns out to be pretty unserious, good chunk of it, or pretty easily confused, or pretty easily preyed upon, deluded, etc. Maybe that's always been the case to some degree, one could say in response. But the elites were better. And I guess that, for me, and actually, frankly, you can probably survive having pretty decadent elites with a pretty healthy and robust public. You can survive having a somewhat, let's say, sloppy and self-indulgent and silly and even hysterical public if the elites are strong and keep them in effect. Don't let those hysterical sentiments manifest themselves too much, or think of intelligent ways to let them harmlessly manifest themselves. Weak elites and a not so great public, irresponsible elites and an irresponsible public. That is really a recipe for disaster. And add in a system that, just because of various, things, parts of it not being updated and fixed, and some unanticipated effects of certain aspects of the system that have been around a long time, a system that's pretty creaky, let's just say, you add those three things together, that is not a good situation.
So the British Expeditionary Force is back in the English countryside, and we are celebrating our great evacuation. What next? Right? What is, if we care about democracy and you're in it for the democracy, what are the next steps in the campaign? The culmination is 2024, obviously, where I think it is safe to assume that there is a high chance that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. It's not a slam dunk, but I think if he wants to run and there is not a health event, then he will be the nominee. And judging from everything we know about his character and his motivations and incentives, I think he has very strong incentive to run, because the argument that he hates to lose has now been totally taken away, because he can't lose. He knows that he has 70 million people in America who will think that he won no matter what he did. So what does he care if the people at the New York Times say he lost? Where do we go from here?
A good question. I mean, and of course, all these analogies are limited, and as we've learned in the last several years, forecasting the future is very difficult. I mean, some of these things could change faster than we fear. It could be a little more of an upside shift than we expect. Just as there was so much more.
Name the last time we had an upside shift anywhere in the world.
Well, think about that. 1989. I mean, that was the huge
that's
surprise.
the last time.
Maybe.
Yeah. George Will used to say that as a boy he would watching the Cubs. He would his favorite player. He would think to himself as he struck out over and over again, "Well, he's due. And it wasn't until he became a little bit more sophisticated at math that he realized that a 130 hitter is never due. We are not due.
Well, maybe, yeah. So, fair point. That was a good dark JVL point. But of course, maybe we are actually our 270 hitter, and we're just hitting 190.
This country
for
is
now,
not a 270 hitter.
I mean, I guess my only point I'd say is obviously 24 is huge, but 2022 is very big. Both the election itself, I mean, maybe, it's baked in. People say that Republicans will win the House and all the normal rules of off-year elections. I'm not quite sure about that. It's such a volatile time. Who knows? They could screw things up. Roe v. Wade, there's a lot going on. But I think we began with the COVID commission, and there's also the January 6th commission. If on those two things, is it out of the question that the country could be in a better place in its understanding of those two issues by the end of 2022? I mean, could we have had elections in which some of the craziest Republicans have lost primaries to saner Republicans, in which some Democrats have made intelligent cases for both public health issues and other issues, of course, the economy and so forth, but also on Trump's authoritarianism, that the country sort of sees in a way what the cliff we're heading towards? I don't know. I mean, I think 22 is important. It's a little hard to write the scenario if you want to use your, this ridiculous, the Dunkirk analogy. They did win the Battle of Britain after that. I mean, the Royal Air Force, they beat back the German attempt to bomb them to smithereens and to lay the groundwork for a possible invasion even. And around the rest of the world, things were at least stable enough that by the time Hitler made the mistake of invading the Soviet Union and then we got attacked, it could be reversed. But it is, of course, a good reminder that those two things had to happen to really reverse the course of World War II. Otherwise, at best, Britain would have sort of hung on with some of its Commonwealth. So we're not going to get some Deus ex machina like what happened in 1941. So can we sort of struggle back to at least a position where we stop going downhill and start making some progress on some of these things? Am I crazy to think the January 6th committee could be meaningful? I mean, I'm still struck by the reaction to Liz Cheney. I was talking with Pete Wender about this yesterday. Actually, we got together. I mean, she's really sort of feels like she's broken through in a way that almost none of the other Trump critics has. And I think it's because she's totally focused and only focused on the urgent question of liberal democracy. She doesn't confuse it all with, here's my other critiques of 18 other things. She doesn't confuse it with defenses of 18 other things either, incidentally, some of which she agrees with Republican orthodoxy than we do, I think. But maybe there's some sign there that, but of course then her race becomes important and the reaction to her victory or defeat becomes important. So I'm struck, and my instinct is that 2022 is a very important intermediate year here. And if things slide downhill in 2022, culminating in a bad election in November, that's a tough hole to dig out of in 2023 and 2024.
Yeah.
And finally, of course, a lot depends on the Biden administration, right? I mean, they'd be helpful if they didn't mess too many things up and if they had some successes and got some luck, and maybe they will.
It would be helpful. On the other hand, it does feel as though a lot of the cake is baked in. I was looking the other day, there was a headline a couple weeks ago about how, I believe it was Nebraska, it could have been Oklahoma, but one of those two states, I believe it was Nebraska, again, this is like 3 weeks ago, had just recorded the lowest unemployment rate in the history of unemployment
Yeah, I think
rates.
it was Nebraska, right?
Right. And I thought to myself, okay, I've always been told it's the economy, stupid. And if people are getting jobs and wages are going up, then that's all anybody cares about. And this doesn't register. Unemployment keeps ticking down. There are good indicators out there as well. But the Biden administration doesn't get credit for any of those with voters, and somehow finds the sour spot on a lot of stuff. They found the sour spot on Afghanistan. They found the sour spot on the child tax credit, which mystifies me.
Yeah.
I was convinced the child tax credit was going to be a transformative piece of legislation that was really going to open the way for pro-family populism for Democrats, and instead turns out to be becoming something like the Cadillac driving welfare queens or something, where it is now an advantage issue for Republicans, which I do not understand at all. I don't know, and I look at it and again, historically, so the three most recent reelected presidents are Obama, Bush, and Clinton. Obama and Bush had vast reservoirs of goodwill leading into their reelections, just personal goodwill with voters. Voters really liked them. Bush he was a wartime president, and he was making an explicit case about the war being prosecuted. Biden does not have those reservoirs of goodwill with voters to draw on that Obama and Clinton did. And I think that is telling. Obviously the environment's changed. We're more polarized. Even getting to like 52% approval is a Herculean task. But it does feel like all this is moving to a place where the center can't hold, right? I mean, at some point the polarization becomes so deep that nothing works. No?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's yeah. Your focus on polarization, I think, is right, and with the caveat that, as some people have pointed out, it's not a symmetrical polarization. It is polarization on both sides, to be sure, but with a kind of radicalization on the right that's really extraordinary. And so the polarization / radicalization makes it very hard just to govern, obviously, and Biden's found that out with 50-50 Senate. But I agree, something like the lack of agility by Biden and by the Biden administration, whether it's on separating out the child tax credit and bringing that to the floor, sitting down with Romney, working out a deal and bringing it to the floor, and let McConnell and the Republicans try to filibuster that. That's not such some of them are on the record as being for versions of that, and that's a cleaner vote than some complex bill with 15 different programs in it or something, some of which are pretty dubious in my opinion. This is one that has had conservative support. Anyway, lack of legislative agility, I would say. And again, on COVID, which should be just a lay down that if we got an administration that understands and cares about public health as opposed to one that didn't. I'm worried that he's botched the testing so much, an issue that we've been obsessed with, following the lead of many actual public health experts, the rapid testing, and somewhat botched the booster rollout, if not the vaccine rollout itself, sufficiently that it's now murkier. Having said that, so it is bad. It's bad. Having said that, the irresponsibility of the conservative elites, if I can just come back to my favorite theme, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial, I guess it was yesterday maybe.
Yes,
short
the Great
one.
Barrington Declaration.
Literally, I mean, they don't quite have the nerve to defend this lunatic declaration, this fake science, and natural infection, that'll work great without vaccines, right? Now you look at the death rates of people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated, and of course vaccinated and boosted and unvaccinated. And then people are still defending, let natural infection just rip through everything. But they don't quite have the nerve to defend it, so they attack the people who criticized it, Fauci and Collins and others.
Yeah.
But that's why. Okay, if they don't want to retract their truly shameful acquiescence in total quack science and conspiracy theories and anti-vaccination hysteria, if they don't want to retract that and apologize for that, maybe they could just be quiet now, or they could publish a conventional piece, which you and I might agree with, partly that they should have done more to get rapid tests approved. And that's a classic conservative Wall Street Journal type deregulatory argument. This is FDA regulations set up for one thing, for diagnostic devices, not for public health. And let us quote 19 public health experts showing that this is crazy. And why is the Biden administration so passive in dealing with the bureaucracy? Totally standard. In this case, I think mostly true, conservative argument. That's not what they're doing. It's very revealing that they need to go out of their way to defend or to criticize the critics of the Great Barrington Declaration. Don't you think? I mean, it just shows how corrupt the conservative elites are.
It is anti-vax, or would it be anti-vax? I don't know. But it's one of these things where, again, one needs to signal sympathies with this important part of your constituents, right? And but until we live in a world where there is a price to be paid for this sort of behavior, we're going to get more of it. Right. This is how incentives work.
Yeah, and the lack of accountability for anyone watching and this comes back, maybe we should close on this. I think I said this the other day, and I thought about it a little bit more. I just hadn't really occurred to me. Could this have been different if the Senate had voted to convict Trump? If there'd been a real trial, I hold the Democrats partly responsible. If the Democrats had not said, "Oh, it's Valentine's Day weekend" or whatever it was, as I recall vaguely, I think that's what it was.
Yeah.
We're going to get out of here on Saturday. We're going to sit here for a week and have witnesses, and some of the stuff that we've now learned would have come out. And if it didn't, they would have could have at least made a fuss about people not producing documents. And we're going to do that for 2 weeks, and fine, it'll slow down Biden's agenda by 2 weeks. We don't, if it would. We don't care. And then we're going to have a real trial. And that's the Democrats' responsibility. They controlled the Senate at that point. But, of course, the much bigger responsibility is the Republicans, only 7 of whom voted to convict. If 25 Mitch McConnell had led half the Republican conference in the Senate to convict Trump, could that have lanced the boil in some ways? Maybe. I think that was a little more of a moment than I guess. I mean, I, of course, wanted them to do that at the time, but I didn't kind of realize after it had happened that we had just missed what might have been the biggest opportunity to make a real difference in 2021.
Well, I mean, one thing it would have done is by removing Trump as a potential nominee, it
Right.
would have allowed the Republican Party to actually go through a postmortem and all the accompanying infighting that comes with that, and thus would have allowed the potential for a pro-democratic caucus within the Republican Party to emerge. But
Or a less anti-democratic caucus. And I was thinking about that. So I think the way it works is if you impeach and convict, you then have to separately also say that this person should be disqualified from holding public office again. I think that's been done when judges have been convicted, or maybe some others have been convicted of this. Of course, Trump would have objected. He said, "I'm ignoring this. This is unconstitutional." God knows what he would have said, right?
that's right. What if he then just runs anyway?
But at least then the Ron DeSantis of the world have sort of an incentive to say, "Oh no, we have to obey the Constitution." I mean, Mitch McConnell would have said that. I don't know. Conceivably, others would have. Ted Cruz would have had an incentive to say it. It would have muddied the
Iowa
waters.
State Republican Party would have put him on the ballot anyway for the
Well,
caucus,
probably.
right?
I mean, but that
Yeah.
would have been a little clearer that they're just ignoring
Could
what
you
the
imagine?
United States Senate did, including with a lot of Republicans. So it might not have changed very much at all, But
Yeah.
it was a moment in retrospect, I think, where people were hurrying to move on and kind of hoping, I assume McConnell, it'll fade away. And of course, as you said, no one was held accountable, and it hasn't. And the key point is, and the point of this whole conversation was, it hasn't faded away, and in fact, it's gotten somewhat worse. The virulence, the infection has not receded, and it remains as dangerous as ever. Maybe more dangerous, with the caveat that Trump's being gone, not president, is a good thing.
So before we get out, exogenous events are always have the opportunity to disrupt everything. The exogenous event that is on the horizon right now today is Russia and Ukraine. And what does it look like is going to happen over here? And this could be very, very bad, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was at an event, one of the great things until, of course, a week ago with Omicron, but for the last couple months was getting out a little bit and mixing and mingling and going to kinds of events where
It's the worst.
I know they're bad and they are boring. And of course, one ends up ducking out of 2/3 of them, but you still get to chat with some people who know something or whatever. So I was surprised at this particular event how many people, it was, I guess, off the record and all this, how many people thought Putin, I mean, these are serious people who know a lot, have been in government in both parties and so forth, who thought Putin would go in a pretty big way to Ukraine. Maybe not try to conquer the whole country, but take part of it and do some real damage and do something bold to show the Russian people that he was winning and the West was losing. Iran, I'm now very alarmed about. They've really spent a year kind of just escalating the nuclear program with no real pushback from us. God knows with China. So yes, there are major foreign policy challenges. I'm much more alarmed about them than I was just a month ago. And the Biden administration, I think directionally is okay on these issues. They're not doing anything terrible mostly. But the Afghanistan pullout, which ironically is the one thing they did that was popular in the polls, not the one, but a thing they did that was popular as an idea. It was done so badly, and maybe also people had to, when they saw the real consequences, it wasn't so popular anymore, even if it had been done better. That conveyed, and who cares about the polls at some point on foreign policy issues, it conveyed to the world a sense of weakness that I was against it. I was very critical of it. I wrote things in the Bulwark, as you recall, that were critical of it. We all did. But I underestimated how much damage it would do. I've now run into people from all over the world, diplomats and others, people who've talked to diplomats and serious people who say that sent a signal to people all over, to our allies, but also obviously to the Putins and Xi's and Iranian regimes of the world, that we want to get out of places and we're going to do it in a pretty, if Biden wants to do it, we're just going to do it. We're not going to be careful about allies and people who've worked with us. We're not going to do it in an orderly way. We're not even going to give our allies much of a heads up, or consult them. So I think that did a lot of damage. So I'm more worried about the whole foreign policy side of things than I was a couple of months ago.
What does Europe do if Putin moves into Ukraine? I mean, there's the American component to this, but there's also the European component.
They're not going to do much.
We are not a reliable ally, right? And
I mean, they're at best always queasy about dealing with in a tough way with Putin. They're a lot closer, and they also don't have whatever our tradition of standing up quite to Russia, you might say, in some ways. But they're certainly not going to do anything.
Gas.
They're certainly not going to do anything if we don't. And the gas thing will be a huge issue. And that early signal that Biden sent, and I was unhappy about it. I think we criticized it in the Bulwark. But
the Nord Stream 2.
The Nord Stream 2. But, you sort of think, okay, that was one decision. We're going to move on. One sometimes underestimates, I think this is true really in foreign policy especially, how much a few decisions that stand out and that we here kind of lose sight of in the maelstrom of events can really damage U.S. standing. And I'm pretty worried about the Biden administration's standing among our allies and in the face of our rivals a year in.
Well, Bill, thanks.
Great. I think I really helped you, Jonathan, here. You came on kind of darkish and worried, and I've just been Mr.
Charlie is never going to let the two of us sit down together on his show ever again without having him or Sarah or Mona or somebody to bring a ray of sunshine here. 2022, it'll be even worse.
Yeah, I feel bad that we're ruining Poor Sarah, she always wants to be upbeat, and she's going to listen to this. She's a pretty diligent listener, and I don't know. I feel bad. I'm sorry, Sarah. I apologize on behalf of JVL. And
I just do want to, in defense of what we have just done here for the last 40 minutes, though, I would say that I don't think we engage in catastrophizing.
No.
I think that we have been basically right about everything important over the last 2 years, the Bulwark. Right about COVID, right about Trump, right about authoritarianism. And it is desperately important to be clear-eyed about these things, because wishing them away or fixating on best-case scenarios or pretending, well, he's learned his lesson this time, that is the road to perdition. And the only way to fight for a better future and to try to make things better is to be clear-eyed about the present.
And to have a sense of urgency, I think, which I really think a lot of people who are otherwise, kind of fairly sensible about things, just for some reason or other, don't quite have. Maybe because if you see it, if you see it clearly in a way that gives you a sense of urgency, there's a real responsibility then to act and not to sort of evade some of these choices.
All right, Bill, happy holidays. I will see you in the new year. Everybody, thanks for joining us. Charlie will be back soon, I promise.